Welcome back. This is week 4, lecture 2, Christendom and the Holy Roman Empire. And this lecture is the last lecture of this section of the course, part 1, Basic Structures of Christendom. And hereafter, then you will have your first midterm. And I will be talking about your first midterm more at the end of this lecture. But this is kind of the summation of what we've been talking about in terms of providing the structures and the point of departure for the high and later Middle Ages, so to speak. And we talked about feudalism and manorialism. We talked about monasticism. So these are all basic institutions, so to speak, of what comprised Christendom. And I talked about the myth of Christendom. I'll be talking about the myth of Christendom again, because it wasn't a thing, it was an idea, a concept. But ideas and concepts have impact. That's the point. Now, let's say politically, kind of chronologically, I finished a lecture a week or so ago on Charlemagne and the Carolingian Renaissance. And this lecture looks at the breakup of Charlemagne's empire and the structures that came about thereafter, and the developments that came about after Charlemagne. Because with Charlemagne, whom I kind of said was the father of Europe, we'll see more of that, why that was the case today. Things did change. Charlemagne was crowned Roman Emperor in 800. As I said before, Roman Emperor. We'll be talking more about that distinction between Roman Emperor and Holy Roman Emperor later in this lecture too. And controlled more territory north of the Alps than had any individual since Rome. Now, that concept of the continuation of the Roman Empire was to have central importance for the development of quote unquote the West. And in some ways, it's still with us, even though the idea changes, as we will see today. So that's kind of what we're talking about, kind of this period, let's say from 300 CE to approximately 1000 CE. How do we understand the developments that can be described as late antique, early medieval as the point of departure for starting to understand the high and late medieval developments, which is what the course is getting at. Again, the terminology we use often affects how we understand those developments. I'll be talking more about that too today. So that ties in with the early lectures on this kind of theory of history and how do we go about doing history and what does this all mean. So that's kind of the context here. And this is based too on the first midterm, because if you look at the first midterm, the essay question is conceptual, but it's conceptual based on then the details and specifics of the historical developments. And that is kind of the key, is to connect the general statements with the particulars. Now, when we then get going with this and look at Charlemagne, when Charlemagne dies in 814, what then happens? In this first slide, from Charlemagne to Otto I, attempts to address that issue, and this is the major part of this whole lecture, is this section, which is like the second point of the lecture. We have the introduction, which I've just kind of completed, and then we have from Charlemagne to Otto I, which is basically the whole structure or whole content of this lecture in terms of actual historical developments. And we begin then with the breakup of Charlemagne's empire. So we have here the problem of succession. The Franks, as I think I tried to say, after having become Christian under Clovis, they viewed it, their realm, very personally. Clovis viewed it was his territory, it was his kingdom. He was the king of the Franks as an individual. And it was his possession. The kingdom of the Franks was his. So when he dies, it then became split up between his sons. And as I then mentioned, there were conflicts there all over the place between the various descendants of Clovis until we get Pepin and the Franco-Papal Alliance and the emergence of the Carolingians, which of course goes back to Charles Martel, the mayor of the palace, blah, 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 blah. And Charlemagne unified this realm of the Franks that had been somewhat unified, but then still divided up again and everything, under his authority and rule. And as I talked about the Carolingian Renaissance, its centralization and standardization were the key issues there. And so the problem is, when Charlemagne dies, what then? He had one surviving son, Louis the Pious, as he was called. So that was somewhat easy. But what happened thereafter wasn't. Because Louis the Pious, I'm not going to go into all the details, rules, comes to rule in 814. That's what that is. That's not his death date. That's when he started to rule. Had three surviving sons. He actually had four sons, but one died before hands in with two different wives, and it gets to be a really mess in terms of the family issue. So there's tensions there over who was going to succeed the father Louis the Pious. And these tensions, first with all four sons and then with the three surviving sons, became one of family dynamics and politics over who was going to succeed their father. And the three boys, I mean, they were men, but boys, sons of Louis the Pious, did not get along, let's say. And they're fighting already before Louis dies. And even some of them ally with the father who fights against others. And we have these three sons, surviving sons, namely Charles the Bald, as he was called. We have Louis the German, and we have Lothar. And they're fighting sometimes with the father, kind of Lothar and Louis the Pious, fight against Charles and Louis the German. And when Louis dies, Louis the Pious dies, it's just open warfare between the three surviving sons, the three grandsons of Charlemagne, until 843. Because in 843, they got together and they agreed on a way to divide their inheritance in the Treaty of Verdun of 843. And here I have the map put up there. Charles the Bald got the western Frankish realm. Louis the German got the eastern Frankish realm. And Lothar got that central part between Charles and Louis the German. And he got the title Emperor. So Lothar became the emperor. If you look at that map, his territory was not as extensive as was Charles the Bald's in the west or Louis the German's in the east. So Charles the Bald and Louis the German recognized Lothar as emperor. But just think about this for a minute. It is a title that almost without any force behind it, because they couldn't care less. They all claimed descent from Louis the Pious, who was the son of Charlemagne. So they're all the successors of Charlemagne. If we look at that map, what we see is the Western Frankish kingdom, the kingdom of Charles the Bald, was to develop into France, the kingdom of the Franks. Francia became France. Louis the German Again, that is a designation of ethnicity, of linguistic ethnicity, not political entity. And this time, ruled a territory that in 1871 would become Germany, more or less. And Lothar had that reign or that realm in between. It was referred to too as the territory of Lothar or Lotharingia, or in French, the Lorraine. And France and Germany fought over the Lorraine ever since, quote unquote, France and Germany, all the way through World War I, World War II. That middle section, where did it really go? Because it didn't really fit anywhere. Whereas at least there were reasons for the split between the East and West, the West and the East, Frankish kingdoms. The Treaty of Verdun is the first document we have that was the first treaty that we have, I should say, the first treaty that we have, first diplomatic document that we have, that was translated into early French and into early German. Because just as the East-West split of the Roman Empire was too linguistic between Greek and Latin, with Greek then becoming predominantly in the East and Latin in the West, so did Charles the Bald and Louis the German realize that their nobles, not all of them could read Latin. So they had it translated, the Latin treaty, translated into the local language so that everyone could understand what was going on. And that division between these three central parts, as we see there, and then, of course, the emperor with the Franco-Papal alliance claimed the northern Italy all down and still support of the Pope, really sets the stage for Europe. When so often we talk about the history of Europe, what we're talking about is the history of these three territories. Spain is kind of there, England is kind of up there too, but almost tangentially. This is what we're talking about. The central through Italy, what became France, what became Germany. Now, is that real? Does that mean that France and England, nothing was going on? Absolutely not. A lot was going on. And did they have an impact? Oh, yes, they did. But the question then is one of perspective and focus. And for somehow historians of Spain are almost distinct. Historians of Europe, medieval Europe, focus on, France, Germany, and somewhat England. Historians of England focus on England. So it is artificial in terms of the amount of scholarship devoted to it. In some ways, too, a lot of scholars who study France and Germany in the Middle Ages, or England too, don't read Spanish. They can read German and French and English, but not Spanish, maybe. Sometimes Italian. Germans can read Italian often because that's what their area. And a lot of the Spanish historians don't really read German. So it becomes also a linguistic problem in terms of the scholarship of who is describing what was going on. We have to keep that in mind. But the point here is that territorially, politically, this Treaty of Verdun set the basic structure for the development of Europe on through then the 20th century. That's why it's so important to understand what was going on and why the division of Charlemagne's empire divided between his three grandsons. Now, I have here the foundation of modern Europe. Yeah, that's what I would claim that it is. But as that is developing, as the Treaty of Verdun takes effect, there's still the concept of Christendom. There's still the concept of the Christian empire, even if Charles the Bald and Louis the German didn't really pay much attention to their brother or half-brother Lothar. Actually, Lothar and Louis the German were the brothers, and Charles the Bald was the half-brother, but that's, again, not going to go into that all those details. there's still that concept. And that concept of Christendom, of the Christian empire, the Imperium Christianum, in the course of the 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th centuries, was under threat yet again. Being under threat by the Islamic invasions. We said that's how Carolingians came into power with Charles Martel in the Battle of Tours or the Battle of Montpellier in 732. And in so many ways, Christendom was formed by responding to threats from outside. Because we have new invasions, particularly in the 8th and 9th century, of two groups that were definitely different from, quote unquote, the Europeans, whether that was the Germans or the French, or what would become the German or the French, or the English even. So, this is what we're kind of looking at. And what were these groups? The new invasions, as I pointed out, the Vikings and the Magyars. And the Magyars were the Hungarians. So, these groups, what do we do with them? The Northmen, or the Vikings, the Magyars. The Vikings is a term we really don't find until the 12th century. Vikinger, or the Viking. They were known by the Europeans as the Northmen because they came from the north, Scandinavia. Now, it's difficult to determine were they Danish, were they Norwegian, were they Swedish? Yes. Scholars will debate in the different groups because there wasn't a single group, ethnic group called the Vikings. These were raiders, Raiders, raiders from the north. They were experts in shipping and seafaring, and they had what's called the Viking longboat that could navigate the rivers. And so what they would do, and they were very quick, they could then come down and follow the rivers, attack on all the sides of the rivers, and get out before they could even be defended. These were quick raids, and all of a sudden it's like, what? We're being raided. This isn't, again, not like there's television or email at this time, so that now we have everything happening. We can get news about what's going on almost simultaneously as it's happening. There, it did not work that way. And it sent fear throughout the territory. What do we do about these raids? First on the English coast, and through England, they raid monasteries, because why? Well, monasteries had a lot of wealth, gold. Then in northern Europe, especially northern France, come down to the rivers, the Rhine, etc., attack and leave. And so before the nobles, the counts, the dukes, etc., could organize a defense, they were already gone. How to deal with all of this? And in some ways, there was never really a solution, but one solution became a similar solution to the Romans with the invading Germanic tribes, invading the barbarian invasions. As I said, they're not invasions, they're migrations. Namely, to accept some of them. And there were some groups of Northmen, as they were called, later Vikings, who then did become Christian, because once Europe realized what was going on, and already with Charlemagne, keep in mind, they had the Saxons in the north, and Charlemagne conquers the Saxons and Christianizes them by conquest. It was known already that there were people further north of the Saxons in Scandinavia who'd come. It's very difficult to know how they migrated into Scandinavia and down, and the whole migrations of peoples and tribes. And there was this sense of, we are in opposition to them. We still have to worry about these pagans further up in the north, beyond the boundaries of Christendom. We tried to Christianize them. Missionaries were sent to the north and rejected, but some groups finally became Christian, and in the early 10th century, the king of one of these groups, Rollo, made a treaty with Charles II of what became France, the Western Frankish Empire. And Charles II gave Rollo territory where they could settle. Now, it's like, why settle? Well, there's all kinds of theories and explanations. One of these things are the Vikings were the younger sons of kings and leaders of the Scandinavian tribes. So thereby they were not going to inherit. And so they had to kind of forge their own path and fortune. It's not really clear why they were doing what they were doing. And then, of course, there's the whole issue of Greenland and Iceland and whether or not the Vikings made it to North America as well. But that's not the focus here. But that is still something to keep in mind in terms of these were sophisticated people and seafaring people that were very developed. They were not barbarian anymore than were the Franks in that sense, in that qualitative sense of barbarian. They didn't really know Latin. They had to be Latinized. They had to be Christianized. But the territory that was ceded to Rollo became known as the territory of the Northmen, or Normandy. The Duchy of Normandy became a major duchy in the Kingdom of France. And then, too, as we will see, or after the midterm, we have the famous Norman invasion of England in 1066. So they have kind of spread their influence and become assimilated within Christian culture, European culture, and ideas. And it's a real, again, a melting pot of ethnicities that formed Europe and Christendom. So the Vikings, quote unquote, are a fascinating people. Also difficult because a lot of what we know about the Vikings come from 12th or 13th century sources, the so-called Viking sagas, which go back to earlier stories, clearly. But still, it's difficult. And the term Viking, as I said, was forged in the 12th century to refer to all these different peoples. The Northmen as such, because the Northmen is not a group, just peoples from the north coming in and raiding and things. But the issue of Normandy, once you can have these quote-unquote enemies as allies, you can use them to help fight against their previous allies or enemies. So they can use Northmen to fight against the Northmen. So you give them a base in Normandy, and they can help fight against increasing raids. And that was what the kind of the purpose and function of Normandy and the Normans. And the Normans then became seen themselves as the defenders of Christendom. And in many ways they were. But that was just kind of on the northern borders of Christendom. On the eastern borders, there were other developments that were problematic, namely the Magyars. Now, Magyars, I have it there, Magyars, the Hungarians, are two rather difficult to pin down who they actually were. Scholars have argued that ethnically, genetically, geographically, they came from South Asia, Central Asia, the Caucasus Mountains, even before. So we're the same place where some of these other Germanic groups did. And there is a close relationship to some extent between the Magyars and the Huns. Now, as I talked about the Huns briefly, everyone was afraid of the Huns. That led to the Goths wanting to become part of the Roman Empire back in the 4th century. They were fleeing the Huns. The Magyars consisted of several different tribes, and one of them became a unifying factor, and that tribe was known as the Magyar. And so it's kind of, the origins, etymology are somewhat obscure, but that's what we can best tell. And they are migrating continuously on the eastern borders of the empire and causing a threat. They too were pagan. They were not Islamic. They were pagan, meaning non-Christian. And interestingly enough, Hungarian is a non-Indo-European language. It's a separate linguistic family, Ungaric. So the origins are strange because they have a different linguistic origin than the Germanic tribes that had migrated into what we call Europe. And it was a real problem how to deal with these peoples. We need to, first of all, Christianize them if we're going to have anything to do with them whatsoever. How do you Christianize people whose language you can't even really speak? They're this foreign people, and they were seen as this huge threat, always on the eastern borders until they became part of Europe as Hungary, or what became Hungary, there in the east. And it was these threats from outside that then led to the further development of internal leadership within, quote unquote, Christendom. And that brings me to the crowning of Otto I, Holy Roman Emperor. So we have then the Treaty of Verdun, 843. We have then the division, and therefore well, it's hard to say. The division is the division, but it also means a lack of centralization, a lack of organization, and more infighting. And we have the threats from outside. Islam still was always there. The Magyars were coming down too, and the threat, and the Vikings from the north coming down and in. How do we handle all this? And in some ways, it was too much for the Europeans. And again, the empire, the emperor, was severely weakened by the Treaty of Verdun. Lothar's territory was the smallest territory, and he's fighting with his other two brothers, or half brother and brother, and was not a united force, which allowed for the incursions of other peoples. It was the last Carolingian emperor was Charles the Fat. Lovely epitaph. We have, Charles the Bald, and we have Charles the Fat, we have Louis the Pious, we have Louis the German. And we go later in the 15th century, we'll have Charles the Bald, but that's another one. Excuse me. But the last Carolingian was Charles the Fat. He dies in 887, and thereafter there was an imperial vacancy. There was no emperor. No one was being crowned emperor, the successor of Charles the Fat and Carolingian. And this imperial vacancy went on for some 60, 70 years. It was only after the Duke of Saxony, one of the major dukedoms in what had been the empire, came to the defense of Christendom, leading forces to defeat the Magyars at the Battle of Lechfeld in 955, to subdue the Magyars, or at least to hold them off, much like Charles Martel did in Spain with Islamic forces. Well, Otto, Duke of Saxony, has also been called Otto the Great, and in so many ways he was great. He was seen as a great emperor, as a great military leader in general. He sought to centralize his territory by replacing nobles that were not related to him with people who were related to him, both in terms of the clergy and the laity, so that he tried to establish, kind of almost after Charlemagne, a centralized governing structure of authority and power under his rule. And especially after the Battle of Lechfeld in 955, he was seen as kind of the savior of Christendom from the threat of the Magyars, or the Huns. And so he also then, as the emperors all along, before, when they were still emperors, defended the papacy. Because if you look at it, that was still part of Lothar's territory, extended down to the Papal States, northern Italy, and then into the Papal States. And so the traditional Carolingian emperors from the Franco-Papal Alliance through Charlemagne were the defenders of the papacy, the defenders of the church in terms of the ecclesiastical hierarchy and the institution, and Otto as the political authority without the title of emperor, when that was within this midst of imperial vacancy, of increasing chaos, tried to create order and control centralized under his authority, and also defending Rome. And because of that, the Pope in 962 crowned Otto Roman Emperor. It's the restoration of the empire once again. Now, I have up here the Holy Roman Empire. I stressed, if I believe I remember, and Myth of the West textbook stresses this too, that Charlemagne was crowned Roman Emperor. And it's not historically accurate to refer to Charlemagne as the first Holy Roman Emperor. Question is, was Otto the first Holy Roman Emperor? And this is where we get to the problem of terminology. And terminology, how it affects our understanding. The position I'm telling you is my position. There'll be scholars who disagree. If we look at the sources, we have three different terms, and I have them up there for you. Imperium Romanum, and so the crowning of Otto I, Holy Roman Emperor. Imperium Christianum, and the Sacrum Imperium Romanum. Now, Imperium Romanum is Latin for the Roman Empire. Imperium Christianum is Latin for the Christian Empire. And Sacrum Imperium Romanum is the Latin for the Holy Roman Empire, or the Sacred Roman Empire. We don't find that term, Sacrum Imperium Romanum, until the mid-12th century with Frederick I, Frederick Barbarossa. So therefore, should we not talk about the Holy Roman Empire until we get to Barbarossa, 12th century, after the midterm? Or do we see it as starting with Otto I and the new dynasty? The Carolingians are over. The Saxon emperors are now in ascendancy. And Otto, we talk about the Carolingian Renaissance. There's also scholars who have talked about the Ottonian Renaissance in the 10th century, i.e. the 900s under Otto. And there was the continuous development from the Ottonians, then in the 12th century into the Hohenstaufen with Frederick, a new dynasty, but there was not this imperial vacancy as there had been. So there's a continuous tradition, even with the change of dynasty, from Otto I on all the way until 1806, when Napoleon gets rid of the Holy Roman Emperor. Just is gone. That's why I argue that it really starts, the Holy Roman Empire really starts with Otto I, even though the term was not there any more than it was with Charlemagne. But with Charlemagne, we can see this development from the Roman Empire and the East-West division, the Translatio Imperii, as I had, that's not my term. It was the term that was used. Translation of the empire, first from the Latins to the Greeks to the Germans. But then there's this interregnum, as it's often called, the period of between the two reigns, between the Carolingians and the Ottonians. And with the Ottonians, we have then a continuous development, even with changes of dynasty, from the Saxonian emperors, the Saxon emperors, to the Hohenstaufen, and then finally to the Habsburgs. Where does it begin? If we want to refer to the Holy Roman Empire as holy is sacred, as being identical with Christianity, with the Christian Empire. So if we equate the Imperium Romanum with the Imperium Christianum, we can say that starts with Theodosius in the late 4th century, when Theodosius proclaims Christianity the only legal religion of the empire. There's legitimate reasons for doing that, because under Theodosius, the Roman Empire was now a Christian empire, or at least it was an empire that became Christian in terms of its religion and faith, legally defined. Because I made that distinction between the Roman Empire that became Christian and the Christian Empire. That I think is an important distinction to keep in mind. Because with Charlemagne, there's no question anymore. It is the Christian Empire, and we have that in the sources: the Imperium Christianum, the Populus Christianus, the Roman people, or the Christian Empire, as a political entity. After the Treaty of Verdun, the empire was a lot less powerful than it had been before. After the Treaty of Verdun, with Otto, it begins to reclaim some of that pre-Treaty of Verdun authority and power, so that the emperor becomes an equal leader of Christendom, at least with the King of France, or what would become the King of France, and basically subsumed that Eastern Frankish Empire of Louis the German. So it became also known as the Germanic Empire with Frederick Barbarossa. So you have the empire, we have Kingdom of the Franks, or Francia, France. We have England up in the north. That also was connected to France after the Norman invasion of 1066. So what really was Christendom? Was it Germanic? Was it French? Was it English? Somehow combination. And there were these threats from all these other different migrating groups that never really went away. And religiously, even though some of these groups became Christian, became part of Christendom, we still have the threat of Islam, that religiously and theologically was the infidel. And we have the Jews within Christendom. And what are they? They live here, they're part of us, but they're not Christian. Tensions, as there always had been. So the whole point of the myth of Christendom is this: it was this idea, an ideal, that had huge impact, but we can't really say that it ever materialized in quote-unquote reality, whatever reality means. Yes, the empire had borders and boundaries. There was the office of emperor and territory that went with the empire. And then there was also then the personal territory of the emperor from Otto I on, which was more the Eastern Frankish kingdom, became kind of the personal territory. But then so it becomes a real mess in terms of dividing this all up, and yet this idea of Christendom and of the empire remained, at least by a tacit acknowledgement. that yes, Rome is still continued, but if you're not the emperor, we don't really have to pay attention. We don't have to listen to you really, because you know what? If I'm king of France, I'm an emperor in my own territory, and I too trace my heritage back to Charlemagne, who traced his heritage back to the Roman Empire. Now, I want you to know the complications, and I want you to know the various terminology. If you want to argue that the Holy Roman Empire started with Charlemagne, you may do so, but you have to acknowledge the issues there. So if you were to say, well, as Professor Sack has argued in his lectures and in The Myth of the West, the Holy Roman Empire began with Otto I, the Holy Roman Empire. And as he pointed out in his lecture, week 4, lecture 2, the term Sacrum Imperium Romanum, we don't find in the sources until the 12th century, mid-12th century with Frederick Barbarossa. So technically there was no such thing as the Holy Roman Empire until we have the Germanic Empire of Frederick II. And yet, if we equate the Christian Empire with the Roman Empire, and the Christian Empire as then a holy empire, we can see it starting not only with Charlemagne, but we can also see it starting with Theodosius. If you argue it in those terms, you may do so. What I don't want to see is simply an assertion, Charlemagne, the first Holy Roman Emperor, blah, 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 blah. That I would not accept, because that's not the position that I'm presenting you. You don't have to agree with me that we can talk about the Holy Roman Empire beginning with Otto I. I'm giving my reasons for doing so. But you need to know that position. And then you can say, but when we actually look at what's going on, we can't really talk about it in terms of the sources until the 12th century in Frederick Barbarossa, even though that's after the midterm. And we can either see it beginning with Charlemagne or with Theodosius. We can't see it beginning with Constantine, because Constantine simply made Christianity a legal religion of Rome. It wasn't until the end of the 4th century in Theodosius where Rome became Christian, the only Christian, only religion of the Roman Empire. So that's kind of where that is all coming from. And I hope this is clear. If not, you can always ask. But that's what we're getting at. And it's all based, this concept of the Holy Roman Empire or the Imperium Christianum, on power and the holy and the relationship between the two. I've already talked about this in the previous lectures. In this penultimate slide here, the power and the holy, saints' conversions, the sacraments, and the myth of Christendom. I talked about it before in terms of converting the pagans. It was often an issue of our God is more powerful than your God, which they could understand. The pagan Saxons could understand that. The Northmen could understand that, because somehow power is difficult to ignore when you are being subject to it. These things that we see as contradictory, and I've said this before, and I'll say it again, for the medieval mind, we're one and the same. It didn't mean that, this saying that God is over here, and religion and theology is over here, and politics is over here. That's such a modern understanding, because at this time, they're all together. As I said before, Theodosius proclaims Christianity the only religion, legal religion of the Roman Empire. It's a political decision. Constantine had called the Council of Nicaea in 324 to determine what Christianity would believe. Charlemagne was in charge. Otto was in charge, and viewed themselves as the vicar of God, ruling for God on earth. The term vicar of Christ, to refer to the Pope, only develops in the course of the 12th and 13th century, with what we will be talking about after the midterm as the emergence and development of papal monarchy. Now, the Pope, as I argued with the competing hierarchy, still claimed that it was the Pope to be the leader of Christendom. Yet that concept of the proprietary church that I talked about meant that the political leaders from the manor, the individual manor and the village church, parish and church, all the way to the emperor viewed the clergy as working for them. They were an essential part of their rule and their state. That religion, as it was in Rome, was a civic virtue that was part of the governing of the state. And we better get it right, because heresy was not just a theological error, it undermined the state. Now, again, I'm not going to be meaning for this to be a political point for today, but when we think about it today, just think about this. If I were to say I'm a communist, or if I were to say I'm a socialist, even if I'm saying I'm a democratic socialist, and this is the conflict that's going on right here and now with the elections coming up. For some people, that is seen as being treasonous. It undermines what it means to be an American. And I can say, well, why? It's just a political theory. I'm not advocating for the overthrow of the government or anything. I'm just, I'll vote this way or whatever. I'll advocate for it, but it's an idea. It's a position. In my personal position, I should be fine. But no, it's seen as a threat to the state. Now I can say, I'm not a threat to the state whatsoever. The whole issue is, what is the state? What is the state? What does it mean to be an American? How do we deal with immigrants? Do we accept them? Do we view them as suspicious? Do we try to defeat them, or do we try to amalgamate them? How do we deal with these other peoples coming in to our country that was never ours? It was never, again, the territory of the United States originally was that of the Native Americans. And Europeans invaded and took over. Now, I only bring this up because I think it helps us understand what was going on at the time, and vice versa. Meaning, understanding this period of history helps us understand and reflect on what is going on in our world today. And it's not a matter of church and state or individual preference and politics. At this time, it is central to the government of the state. And if I am a political leader, if I'm a count or a duke or prince or even the emperor, I'm in charge and I'm responsible. I know I've said that before. I'm going to say it again and again, because we will not understand this period unless we see this. Because what's going to happen after the midterm is the ecclesiastical hierarchy starts on a campaign for the freedom of the church. What does that mean for them? The freedom from lay control. This too is seen as division of church and state. No, it's the freedom of the ecclesiastical hierarchy from control by the lay hierarchy, whereby then the ecclesiastical hierarchy could then control the lay hierarchy. So it becomes a very messed up system, but we won't understand that development in terms of what we see later as the Gregorian reforms of the later 11th century and the freedom of the church and what that means, unless we put it in this context, the context of the proprietary church of the earlier medieval developments of Christendom on through Otto I and the establishment of what I refer to as the establishment of the Holy Roman Empire. Because around the year 1000, everything changes. Now, changes have already started beforehand, and we'll see that after the midterm, in one major way, going all the way back to 910 and Cluny, the establishment of Cluny in 910. But a lot of these other developments I'll be talking about after the midterm, I'll be using the phrase around the year 1000. because we can't date them specifically. And I'll address that more when we get there. But this is the reason why it's so important to understand what came before, to some extent, to understand all these changes that started to occur around the year 1000 and developed thereafter. That's what this is about. And the power in the holy Christendom was a holy political entity headed by the emperor or the king of France or the pope. And the basis of that spiritual power, of the ecclesiastical power, was the sacraments and the issue of salvation. Because if you didn't believe it, so what? If I didn't believe that there was heaven and hell, so what? No, I'm not going to go to hell. You can tell me I'm going to be going to hell all you want. I don't believe in hell. So there. No. The point is, in terms of the Middle Ages being a so-called age of faith, was it an age of faith? Well, if we define an age of faith as being people who believed Christianity, then yes, it was. The question then is, what did it mean to be Christian? As I said before, it meant, accepting, being baptized and going to Christian worship. Around the year 1000, that begins to change because begin to be efforts to say, okay, now that we're all Christian, how do we really be Christian? Again, that'll be something for after the midterm. But still, here we have Otto I as the Holy Roman Emperor ruling the world, depicted with orb in hand, just like Charlemagne, just like Roman emperors before. The imagery was there. All one big happy family, united under the emperor, once again, which was the same emperor as Julius Caesar and Augustus Caesar, and on we go through Constantine and Theodosius. That's the idea, that's the myth that had huge impact on reality, even though we can't really point to it ever being an actual thing, so to speak. Just like we can't really talk about American democracy. It's an idea. Then we can talk about the form of government and voting and everything, but then how do we define democracy? Isn't it not in our country too, especially with the voter turnout not being always that great, and with the the campaigning based on I have to calculate what percentage of the people that I think are going to vote can I get to vote for me, which is going to be a minority. So it's going to be a minority that elects the rulers, and how is that democratic? Oh yes, but we can't claim that we're not democratic. That's part of our myth. Or I'm a socialist or a communist, that I'm not even a part of it all. I'm not legitimate because of my ideas. But what is America? It's an idea. It's a political entity. You can point to the government. You can point to the geographical boundaries and the hegemonic control of the governing structures. But how's it defined? That's what we're getting at in the problem. And that definition of how we define America, I think we can all realize today, has huge impact on reality. Same with Christendom. It's a myth that has huge impact, or that had huge impact. And we will see throughout this course, right to the very end of it, when Christendom is basically falling apart. And you have to take my B354 to see what happens thereafter. But the point being is, getting back to your first midterm, the foundation of understanding what's going to be happening beginning around the year 1000, namely in the course of the High and later Middle Ages, we have to have some understanding of this beginning. So that's what I've been trying to do, provide you at least in brief with that understanding. And with that said, then I can turn now finally to your midterm itself. It is essential for you to know what's expected. Read carefully the guide to writing the midterm exams. You should know that document. You should know that what you have to do is to download the rubric for the exam, midterm 1. Download it, save it on your device, and you have to answer on that document. And then you have to upload that document into Canvas, into the assignment, midterm 1. And it was kind of complex. It'd be like saying, okay, I'm going to give you, and if we were, meeting in person, I would hand out this rubric. And also would give it to you electronically because you have to write it on, if we were meeting in person, you'd be having a blue book exam. Okay. And that's a very different type of exam than take home online exam. You must cite your references for part 1, the identification of terms. You must cite where you're getting your information, where you're getting your definitions from. The Myth of the West, and for this course, the Myth of the West or the lectures. And you have to give page numbers. The same approach is for part 2 in your essay. You have to defend what you say. So not only is the guide to writing the midterms for both parts essential, so I would claim is the document historical argument. Because the basis of my grading your part 2, your essay, will be how well you have used the course material to present your case and your argument in answering the question that's given to you. It's not about information, but you have to know information. You have to include information. You have to cite things correctly and appropriately. Now, another thing to be aware of. Proofread. Before you hit submit, proofread your exam. Your exam represents you. I've said this before, maybe, I think. You would not go to a professional job interview unless you looked in the mirror to see how are you looking. Are you dressed completely? Did you forget to put your pants on? Did you forget your makeup? Did you forget to do your hair? Are you wearing clean clothes? How do you look? In one way, none of those things matter about how qualified you are for the job or whether or not you can do it and do it well. But if you don't pay attention to those things, you're not going to get the job. You are representing yourself by how you look. When you submit a paper, you are representing yourself. Put your best foot forward. Proofread, go over it, make sure there are no mistakes. Now, again, I don't grade based on grammar or punctuation or spelling. But there's no real excuse. If this were a blue book exam in class, that's a whole different ballgame. It's a different type of approach. But we can't do that in an online 100% asynchronous course. So there's no excuse for getting things wrong. There's no excuse for having misspellings, wrong dates, incomplete sentences, etc. That's not the basis for the grading, but it takes away from the overall impression and leads to a lower grade than if those things were all in order. It also says to me, you don't care. You don't care to follow the directions, to do what you've been told to do. And that's not a good thing, too, because that upsets me. So if you don't care, I don't care. Now, the only reason I say these things is to help you to do as well as you possibly can. And I can say that knowing how I grade, okay, and knowing what I expect. Everything is a given. All the course material is a given. What do you bring from the course material to your case? What evidence do you present in court to me as the judge and jury? That will be the effectiveness of your exam. That will be the basis for my grading your exam, judging your exam, and we can go from there. And again, this is all based on working towards the final exam. And I'll say more about that later in terms of, going over the feedback. I'm going to make comments on your paper, on your exam. We'll be giving you feedback, certainly. And I hope that we could, even meet individually over Zoom to go over things. But again, I'll say that more about that when we get there. But that's kind of the concept. Know what you are supposed to do. Know what the directions and expectations are. And do your best to follow the rules, so to speak. This is not the time to, there's a commercial. It also probably shows my age. I haven't seen it for quite a while. It's like, I think it's for a car. I think it's for like a Nissan or something like that. And it shows a little girl in class, like in second grade, she's coloring. And the teacher very sternly says, stay within the lines, stay within the lines. And the little girl is coloring all over the place. And then it switches and she's driving this car all over the place. It's a great commercial. Your exam is not the time to flaunt the rules. You can show your creativity by how you follow the rules, but then do it creatively. If that makes sense. It's not about simply repeating information. It's about how do you use the information? How do you construct your own meaning based on the information that is presented to you in the course? Not from somewhere else, on the course material. That's what the basis of your grade is going to be. I'm just going to check this final thing. Be proud of your work. Proofread. Argument based on evidence. And yeah, it said define the terms in part 1 so it can't be anything else. I mean, you don't say, Charlemagne was a famous Holy Roman Emperor. Yeah, that doesn't work. Because there's a lot of people who were. Be sure to be specific. Use details. Cite the evidence for your position, both in part 1 and in part 2. Essential for part 1. And do your best. And then try to have fun with it. I know that's kind of a perverse thing for me to say. Have fun with your exam. It should be exciting. I think it should be exciting. I know, some of you may be saying, I just need a grade to get out of here. Okay, I accept that. That's fine. But I hope there's something that has piqued your interest, that has gotten you excited about something. And focus on that. And be excited about doing the drudgery work needed to get a top grade. That will help you get through it. If you have any questions, please just email me about them. If there's any problems, email me about them. This is due on September 18th at 11:59 p.m., and that is that. Again, if there is an emergency, if you're in a car accident, if you're in the hospital with being sick with something, try to let me know beforehand, and we can work with that, okay? I'm not going to go into the whole background of why I'm now having these firm deadlines. I didn't used to. But I think it's important for you. It's a help to me. And simply just do it. I'm open. I'm flexible. I don't like to feel that I'm being taken advantage of, that my goodwill is being taken advantage of. I'm not suggesting that any of you will be doing that at all. But, it's just be professional. I think that's what I said before. Be professional. and do your best. And I'm looking forward to reading your exam. And I will then see you after the midterm. We'll go from there. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.